Welcome to J Lowe Artist YouTube channel. Today we're doing watercolors on 300 series cold press illustration board. It's a lot of fun, it's good practice, and we'll be learning some techniques of just direct painting. Nothing really advanced or anything, but it's good practice. So come on along and do some painting with us. And remember, art makes life better.
First thing I want to do, though, is I want to keep this very, very simple. So on your illustration board, and we're only going to use some small sections of it, so that's why your illustration board is fairly small. I want you to just do a rectangle. Let's keep it nice and simple. And this rectangle does not have to be very large, about 2 inches by, 3/4 inch or so, something about like that. This rectangle is going to represent a little piece of metal. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to decide kind of what metal looks like. What are the properties of metal? And so in order to do that, we need to look at metal. We need to look at it and say, okay, what am I trying to emulate? What am I trying to achieve here? So I've got some pictures of metal. I just want to go through this. This is all very, I tried to find different surfaces, different things. This is a steel guitar, of course. What are some of the things you notice about metal? Highlights, lots of highlights, but those highlights live right next to the really dark shadows. So when we're drawing a sphere, we call that a core shadow, that dark, dark shadow. So you're going to have those dark shadows, but right next to those dark shadows, you're going to have highlights. And so dark and light all living together. The other thing you'll notice is that you go from kind of a mid-gray to a little bit lighter gray, back to a little darker gray. And then on the wherever your light source is, you're going to have highlights, and you're going to have lots of highlights. Depending on your surface. If your surface is fairly easy, flat, you're going to have basically one kind of highlight. Okay. Has any of you ever been to Chicago? Any of you ever seen this? This is, I call it the bean, the metal bean. This is in Chicago. And have you? Chicago, Illinois. Yeah. And it's in a park. It's not far from the Art Institute. If you ever go to Chicago, please take time to go to the Art Institute. It's a big museum, and there's some very, very, very famous artwork in there. But notice how simple this shape is, and that core shadow that represents your horizon line, your eye level line, and this then is your sky with your light source. And notice how it's a little darker towards the top, kind of gets lighter as it goes down. Right across the horizon is very light. Same thing's going to happen with your ground. You're going to have that dark shape in the middle, then it's going to kind of come around, be a little lighter, and then it's going to get darker as it comes towards the bottom. So that's your basics. And let's just explore some more metal pieces. Here's a word that's very simply done. Here are some metal pieces. Notice the highlights on this one are straight up and down because this is a cylinder, and therefore your light sources emulate your object. And the more complex you get, the more you're going to see of those highlights and shadows. And it doesn't matter what direction it's in, you're still going to, those shadows make up that highlight. Here's some objects that we see every single day, and we never really think about the shines or how you're going to paint this or how you're going to draw this. But those highlights and those dark shadows, yeah, that's a sink. Yeah. Here's another letter. One thing to notice when you're doing letters is if you want your metal to look kind of rounded, you're going to have little shadows, little drop shadows, little highlights along the top area. So just kind of keep that in mind. This is one of my favorite things. Armor. And especially shiny armor. But if you look at this, this is just like that bean. You got your highlights at the top. You've got that core shadow, which represents your horizon line, and then your ground that's in there. So here's a motorcycle, and again, it's the same kind of thing. We're not going to be this detailed about doing all the highlights and shadows and things and the reflections in there. But you can still make it look very, very metallic by just doing those darks and lights together. So that's what we want to do when we're doing this in our little rectangle that we've got there. Let's keep this very simple. Right here along the top, if you will, do kind of a little, just a little kind of line with a little up curve there. I guess it's kind of a U shape, if you will. That's going to tell us where our highlights are going to be above here and our shadows are going to be below here. Now, that's about all we're going to do with the pencil. Remember that the pencil, whatever you draw with this pencil, gets fixed with the watercolors. Watercolors are a natural fixative. So whatever you draw in there, if you paint over the top of this, it will never come out, no matter how hard you erase it. While we've been sitting here, our paint has been becoming paint. So I'm going to move this over here like this so you can kind of see what's going on here. I'm going to take, and just a little bit of black, I'm going to put it right there because I want that highlight, I want that shadow area, that core shadow, to be very, very dark. So I'm going to take some, while my paintbrush is nice and clean, I'm going to take just a little bit of water. I'm going to put that water right below that area where I want it to go, right there. So I want to put some water there. What that's going to do is when I drop in the paint, it's going to fuzz out into that area. And if you want your paint to be fuzzy, if you want your surface to be soft and fuzzy and not streaky, get it wet first. And then when you drop water paint into that, the pigment will kind of go throughout all that area. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to barely touch the black with my brush. Remember, we're only using the quarter of an inch of our brush. Most of our brush, it does not have paint on it. You just want that little section up at the top. And I'm just going to drop that in right there. And then I'm just going to let it fuzz. I'm going to let it do its thing. Oftentimes, people try to force water paint. And water paint kind of will do its own little thing. And so you just kind of drop a little bit of that black in there. And you just let it fuzz out. Now, if you wanted to, there towards the bottom edge, you could put just a little edge there too. And as this kind of fuzzes out, if you think, well, I really want it to go a little softer, a little fuzzier, just take your brush and go back and forth all the way down. And hopefully it's going to fade out because all the pigment is going off on your brush. And soon it'll be nice and soft and fuzzy. And if you want to, you could even touch some of that at the bottom with your brush. Pull a little bit of this out and bring it up. And if you don't want more pigment on there, just take it in your paper towel and rub off your pigment onto that paper towel. So you should end up with this kind of fuzzy, soft. So it's darker up at the top, and it gets lighter as it comes down. That's our reflected light, if you will. And then we get a little bit darker on the bottom. Sometimes you're going to get some reflected light here on the edge, so I've left just a little edge there. This is our basis. If it looks good black and white, it's going to look good with color. So now what I want to do is hopefully my brush is dry, and if you just take your paper towel and get off as much pigment as you can, I'm going to dip it once in the water and just make sure my pigment is gone. So I'm just going to go like this, make sure all the pigment is off my brush. Again, you want very little. Now, if you don't want to get the pigment off your brush, hopefully, if you have two brushes, this one's just clean and it's just water. So you could take that one and use that for water. But it's always good to have another brush hanging down, just so that if you need it, if you get too much pigment or something, you can use that other brush. So now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go from the top, and I'm just going to put some water up at the top, and I'm going to bring it down as I go. And I want to get, as soon as I get right next to that dark area, I'm going to stop the water. I don't want any color right in there. I want this to be white, stay white. That's my highlight right there. So then I'm going to drop in some color, and really it doesn't matter what color you use. I'm going to use blue, so I'm just, again, going to very, very lightly touch that watery part of my paint, and I'm going to put in some blue right here at the top. And I'm going to just bring that down, 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 down. And hopefully all the pigment's coming out of my brush, and so it's going to get lighter and lighter as I come down. And if you think, oh, I've got too much pigment on there, your brush can pull that out. You just kind of pull some of that, wipe it off on your paper towel. Now, instead of putting in more paint, I'm just going to touch this with the water, and I'm just going to bring in some of that off to the side. I want it to stay white, right above that darkest area. I want it to stay very white. And I can grab any of this paint that's up in here, I can pull it down. And because it's wet, it's going to fuzz out. It's going to be nice and soft. And again, you notice I'm kind of avoiding the edges. Those I'm going to do something else with. I want a little bit of edge there. While we've done that top, this then has been drying. And so now I want to add some color into that. And again, the color is up to you. You can add whatever color you want to. I'm going to start out with a little bit of yellow. So I'm going to dip my brush in the water, make sure it's clean of all the blue. Because if you dip into your yellow and there's still blue on your brush, it's going to turn green. You should know that, right? So just clean out your brush. And remember, you clean your brush on your paper towel, not in your water. That water should be this clean when we're all done. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to dip my brush once in the water. I can add a little bit of water to this. And then I'm going to just barely touch the yellow just to get enough paint on that brush. Just a tiny, tiny bit. And then I'm going to go back into this. I'm going to pull out some of that yellow, just enough to make it warm. Then I'm going to dry that on my paper towel, dip it once in the water, make sure that the pigment is out. If it isn't, keep cleaning it until it is out. And my paint is starting to dry. I don't know. We must be very dry today. So I'm going to add just a little bit more water to my paints. Now what color are you going to add? I'm going to add a tiny bit of orange. So I'm just going to drop in my brush. Just the very, very tip of it is some orange. I'm going to hit that with the orange just to warm it up a little bit. You don't need much. Remember that when you go back into your brush or into your paint, if your brush has any paint on it at all, it's going to go off onto your paint, on your palette. You don't want that. Little bit of orange in there, just to warm it up. And you might even go more towards the red side. You could actually take a little bit of that red, dip that in there, and get a little bit of red in there if you wanted to. Maybe a little bit on the bottom. Now, if you want to blend that a little bit, just dip it in the water, and you'll be able to blend that just a little bit. You don't want too much in there. With water paint, I don't know why we get the idea that we've got to have all this paint in there that's got to be opaque. Water paint is never opaque. It's always translucent. Unless you're using a tempera or a gouache, those are water-soluble paints, but they're more opaque. I want this core to be very dark. So one of my darkest colors that I'm working with here is going to be purple. So I brushed off my brush. It's nice and dry. So whatever color I pick up is not going to go into my cake. It's going to pull off on my brush. I've got a little bit of purple in there. I'm going to just put that purple in there. That's going to help that get darker. Just a little bit in there. And again, just take your paintbrush, put it in your paper towel. If you want to thin it out a little bit, just dip it in the water, get a little water on there, and just touch it. Just thin it out just a little bit. And then let your paint do its thing. It'll sit there and blend. All you got to do is kind of touch it a little bit and let it blend. I can also, if I wanted to, bring up some of this purple into the side and have a little edge there. If I wanted to. Just a nice tight little edge. Here's a little bit more in the bottom. Maybe that bottom area is going to be a little darker, so I can add a little bit of purple to that dark edge at the bottom there. And again, color is not as important as value. You want your values to be correct. This magenta like purple is really pretty. These are just Crayola washable colors. Got a little bit of yellow on there, so I'm going to hit this with the yellow. Yellow and purple are complementary colors, so what's going to happen when they mix? They're going to kind of go a little bit brown in there, and that's okay. Nothing wrong with that. I can clean up my edges by just taking a wet brush into it like that. I still have some of my pencil that's out here, and I didn't touch it with my paint, so it's not fixed. If I go in and just erase a little bit of that pencil, a little bit there, maybe a little bit on top, that's going to make it feel like a little bit of a harder edge. And if you want your blue a little bit more opaque, I'm just barely touching the brush. I'm going to hit this with a little bit of blue right there. And maybe a little bit on this edge right there. As it comes down, I just lighten that up. Want to keep that little highlight going on there. If I want to blend it a little bit, I'm just going to touch the water to it. Remember, your brush needs to be dry before you dip it into anything wet. Just wipe it off on that paper towel that's in your offhand. Just wipe it off and dip it in the water. You can use that to really create a tiny little edge. And basically, that's it. That's a very simple kind of a shape. This whole thing can be done with colored pencils as well. But, in my opinion, it's faster with water paint. And I think it looks better. And now you can go and clean up any edges. You can take your paint I love purple. Purple is an excellent paint to clean things up with. I'm just going to go in, paint a little bit more purple in there, maybe make it a little darker here and there. This is just kind of dry brush. My brush is dry. I'm just kind of going over the top of things, just smoothing it all out. A little bit of purple in there. If you've gone too far and this is too dark in here, all you got to do is take your dry brush, dip it once in the water, put that water on your wherever you want it to go lighter, let it sit for a second, then take your paper towel, press down on it, and pull it off, and it'll be lighter. It'll pull out some of that. So if you think, oh shoot, I should have put in that reflected light or whatever, that's one way to lighten up your colors. It will never go as light as white, but it will give you a much lighter tone there. And that's the cool thing about this illustration board, is you can go over that several times with that illustration board and lighten it up, because it's very forgiving. Whatever colors you add to it, it's going to be just fine. As long as your values are correct, your colors are going to be just fine. So you can add a little red to it. If you wanted to, you could add a little tiny bit of green to the sky as well, if you want to. Well, to the upper part. Now, that little core shadow and the highlight, those could be anywhere. You could put it down towards the bottom. You can put it towards the top. You know, that's kind of a random. Wherever you choose to put that is up to you. You guys ready for something a little more complex? So this is your technique. This is the way you do that. And this works for all sorts of things like flesh tones. It works for just about anything, really. And that's basically how you do your watercolors. Tiny bit of paint. And your paint should still be clean and beautiful. Okay, you should still have, your water should be nice and clean. Okay.